Imagine being packed into a space so small that you can barely move, your body pressed against strangers on all sides. This was the harsh reality for countless Africans forced aboard slave ships during the transatlantic journey. Shackled and confined, with little room to sit or lie down, many endured days and nights in unbearable conditions. The sheer overcrowding was not just a matter of logistics, it became a deliberate form of punishment, crushing both the body and the spirit. On these ships, every inch of space mattered, yet captains and crew often loaded human cargo far beyond safe limits. The enslaved were denied basic freedoms. The simple act of stretching or turning could lead to punishment, while the constant proximity to suffering and illness created an environment of fear and despair. Psychological torment ran alongside physical suffering, as the knowledge that escape was impossible weighed heavily on everyone aboard. This story reminds us of the resilience of those who endured unimaginable hardship. Despite the cruel conditions, many found ways to support each other, to survive, and to resist in small but meaningful ways. Their courage in the face of such adversity is a powerful testament to the human spirit. If you want to uncover more untold stories from history, explore the strength and perseverance of people who faced incredible challenges. Make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Every story we share helps shine a light on the past, offering lessons that resonate today and ensuring these voices are never forgotten. Stay with us as we dive deeper into the lives, struggles, and bravery of those aboard the transatlantic slave ships. Their experiences are harrowing but essential to understand a chapter of history that shaped generations and echoes through time. As the enslaved Africans struggled to survive in the suffocating confines of the ship, the threat of violence loomed over every movement, every breath. Crew members, armed with whips, sticks, and ropes, patrolled the narrow decks, enforcing a cruel and unrelenting discipline. No act of defiance, no attempt to shift a body for a moment's comfort, went unnoticed, and any perceived disobedience was met with swift and brutal punishment. The sound of leather cracking against skin became an almost constant backdrop, a terrifying rhythm that underscored the helplessness of those imprisoned below deck. Beatings were not reserved only for serious transgressions. Even the slightest misstep or hesitation could provoke a violent response, leaving deep welts, open wounds, and lasting scars that would never fully heal. The fear of punishment permeated the air, shaping behavior as much as the chains themselves. Enslaved individuals learned quickly to anticipate the cruelty, to bend to demands even when their bodies screamed in protest. For resistance was met not just with pain but sometimes with death. The relentless strikes tore at flesh and spirit alike, and yet within this extreme adversity, quiet acts of endurance and subtle defiance persisted. Some would murmur encouragement to their neighbors, share stolen moments of solidarity, or find ways to protect the weakest among them, even as the threat of the whip hung like a shadow over every interaction. Life aboard these vessels was a careful negotiation between survival and submission, a grim dance in which one misjudged movement could bring catastrophic consequences. Injuries from beatings were compounded by the filthy, crowded conditions, as infections took hold where wounds were left untreated, and malnutrition sapped the body's ability to recover. Every punishment inflicted was designed not merely to correct behavior, but to instill a deep and abiding fear, to assert the total control of the crew over lives already stolen. And yet, despite the pervasive terror, many endured, clinging to a fragile hope that their journey would not end in despair, that they might survive long enough to see freedom beyond the horizon. The stories of these brutal punishments reveal more than the cruelty of the captors. They illuminate the incredible resilience of those who suffered under such conditions. Each lash, each strike, while meant to crush, instead became part of a narrative of endurance, of human strength tested in its most extreme form. As we reflect on this chapter of history, it becomes clear that the horror of the beatings aboard slave ships was not only a physical trial, but a profound psychological ordeal, one that shaped generations and left an indelible mark on the collective memory of those who survived. In the midst of unimaginable suffering, the enslaved found ways to persist, to support one another, and to maintain a sense of identity and dignity that their oppressors sought to strip away, revealing a courage that remains staggering in its depth and complexity. Beneath the oppressive heat and the constant stench of human suffering, the enslaved aboard the ships endured another relentless form of torment, the unforgiving grip of iron chains. Shackles bound their wrists and ankles, locking them into positions that allowed barely enough movement to sit or lie, forcing bodies into unnatural angles that tore at muscles and joints over time. Each link of the chain became a reminder of the total control exerted over every aspect of their existence, an instrument of pain that pressed into flesh until raw sores formed. And yet, even as the wounds festered and infections spread, the shackles remained, unyielding and unrelenting. The movement of one person was inevitably constrained by the proximity of others, and as the days stretched into weeks, the simple act of breathing deeply, turning, or adjusting posture became an exercise in endurance against constant, gnawing agony. The physical toll was compounded by the conditions around them. The confined decks were crowded with bodies, the air thick with heat, sweat, and disease, and the opportunity for rest was scarce. Shackles that might have seemed like small restraints at first became instruments of suffering that penetrated every moment of the journey. A relentless companion in a voyage defined by despair. Pain radiated from wrists to shoulders, from ankles to knees, each movement a sharp reminder of vulnerability. And every slight attempt at relief risked the attention of the crew, whose enforcement of discipline was both swift and merciless. The chains were not only a tool of control but a weapon against hope, a methodical way of breaking both body and spirit, designed to ensure compliance and crush any flicker of resistance. Yet, within these excruciating confines, the human spirit's resilience persisted. Enslaved individuals learned to endure in small, almost imperceptible ways, shifting weight to reduce pressure sores, supporting one another quietly, sharing whispered words of comfort in the dark, humid hold. Even amid the agony inflicted by iron and sweat, moments of solidarity emerged, fleeting yet vital, preserving dignity in the face of overwhelming oppression. The chains that bound them physically also highlighted the extraordinary strength required to maintain mental fortitude, to navigate the thin line between survival and surrender, and to carry on with the knowledge that each day endured brought them closer to a freedom they had never known. This chapter of human suffering underscores the calculated cruelty of the transatlantic slave trade, where every measure from the cramped hold to the weight of iron shackles was designed to assert dominance and suppress autonomy. Yet, it also reveals the remarkable capacity for endurance, the subtle acts of resistance that emerged within the harshest of circumstances, and the courage required to endure when every moment was marked by pain and confinement. The legacy of these voyages is etched not only in the sorrow of loss but in the astonishing resilience of those who survived, whose bodies bore the scars of chains while their spirits quietly defied the very forces that sought to contain them. As the days dragged on aboard the suffocating decks of the slave ships, another form of cruelty silently compounded the suffering of the enslaved: the deliberate restriction of food. In a world already defined by confinement, chains, and relentless beatings, the denial of sustenance became a potent weapon in the hands of the crew, wielded to enforce obedience and crush even the faintest spark of resistance. Rations, meager from the start, were further reduced or withheld entirely as punishment for perceived infractions, leaving bodies weakened and minds clouded by hunger. The gnawing emptiness in the stomachs of those below deck was more than a physical torment. It was a calculated tool designed to instill fear, dependency, and a sense of powerlessness that extended far beyond the immediate pain of starvation. The interplay between physical confinement and enforced hunger created a cycle of suffering that was almost impossible to escape. Shackled in close quarters, bodies pressed together in heat and darkness, the enslaved struggled to find even the simplest relief, while the absence of adequate nourishment sapped their strength and resilience. Each denied meal made the already punishing conditions of the voyage even more unbearable, amplifying the injuries inflicted by whippings and chains, slowing recovery from sores and infections, and magnifying the psychological weight of captivity. Hunger became a constant companion, a shadow that hung over every movement, every thought, shaping behavior as much as the chains and the threat of violence. Yet even in this relentless deprivation, the enslaved displayed remarkable endurance and ingenuity. Some shared portions of food in secret, offering small acts of solidarity that provided fleeting relief and a measure of hope. Others developed ways to conserve what little energy they had, resting when they could, supporting one another quietly, and maintaining a fragile sense of dignity amidst the degradation imposed by those who sought to control them completely. The denial of food, while intended to break bodies and spirits alike, instead became another arena in which the human capacity for survival and mutual support was tested and proven. This chapter of the transatlantic slave experience underscores the calculated cruelty that permeated every aspect of life aboard these ships. From overcrowded holds to iron shackles, to beatings and the denial of nourishment, hunger was more than a physical affliction. It was a psychological weapon, one that deepened the suffering, intensified fear, and reinforced the pervasive sense of helplessness. Yet the resilience shown by those who endured such punishment reveals the extraordinary capacity for survival, for compassion, and for quiet acts of defiance in circumstances designed to extinguish both hope and humanity. The story of food withheld as punishment is not simply one of deprivation, but a testament to the strength of those who faced unimaginable adversity, whose courage and endurance echo through history as a powerful reminder of human resilience in the face of systematic oppression. Amid the relentless suffering of overcrowding, chains, beatings, and hunger, acts of resistance aboard the slave ships carried the heaviest risks, for the crew's retribution was swift, severe, and often calculated to instill terror in all who witnessed it. Any attempt to assert even a small measure of autonomy, whether a whispered refusal, a hidden act of defiance, or a more daring escape attempt, was met with punishments designed not only to inflict pain, but to crush hope and deter further resistance. Enslaved individuals who resisted faced punishments that ranged from branding to forced standing in positions so painful that muscles would cramp and bones ached, to public displays of violence meant to make an example of the transgressor. These acts of torture served as both immediate retribution and psychological warfare, a stark warning that defiance, however justified or desperate, would never go unpunished. The atmosphere below deck was suffused with fear, and the echoes of punishment reverberated through the hold long after the violence had ended. The enslaved were acutely aware that any misstep could draw the attention of the crew. And yet, even in these conditions, many found ways to resist, to communicate secretly, to support one another in small but meaningful ways that defied the captor's control. Rebellion, whether in the form of coordinated uprisings or private acts of courage, became acts of defiance against the systematic cruelty that sought to reduce them to mere cargo. The punishments inflicted for such resistance were intentionally harrowing, leaving permanent physical marks and deep psychological scars. Yet they also illuminated the extraordinary courage required to oppose oppression, however subtly or fleetingly. Public punishments, in particular, were orchestrated with a chilling intent to make the entire ship's population witnesses to suffering, so that fear would ripple through the crowded hold and quell any thought of insubordination. The sight of a fellow human being forced into excruciating postures, branded, or subjected to violent restraint created a collective trauma, a grim spectacle designed to maintain control through intimidation and despair. Each act of enforcement reminded those who remained shackled that their bodies were under constant surveillance, that even minor gestures could result in severe consequences, and that survival often depended on endurance, patience, and the careful navigation of an environment dominated by cruelty. Despite the pervasive threat of torture, the enslaved continued to demonstrate resilience, quietly maintaining their humanity through mutual support. Whispered encouragements, and small acts of resistance that preserved their dignity and identity. The punishments, though brutal and terrifying, became part of a larger narrative of endurance, of individuals confronting extreme adversity with courage and determination. Within the shadows of terror, there were acts of solidarity and subtle defiance that spoke to the strength of the human spirit, revealing a capacity to resist mentally and emotionally even when physical resistance seemed impossible. The story of brutal punishment for resistance aboard slave ships thus reflects both the calculated cruelty of the captors and the indomitable resilience of those who endured. It illustrates how oppression sought to dominate not only bodies but minds, yet also how the enslaved found ways to assert their presence, maintain hope, and preserve the dignity of the self in an environment designed to strip it away entirely, even in the face of branding, forced postures, and public humiliation. The persistence of human courage shone through, a testament to the extraordinary endurance of those who survived one of history's darkest chapters. Amid the already unbearable conditions of the transatlantic slave ships, a particularly cruel and pervasive form of oppression targeted the women aboard, adding yet another layer of fear and trauma to an existence defined by chains. Overcrowding, beatings, hunger, and the threat of brutal punishment. Enslaved women were subjected to sexual abuse, a deliberate tool used by crew members to assert dominance and maintain control over the captive population. The abuse was not only an attack on the body but an assault on dignity and identity, designed to instill terror and reinforce the absolute power of those who commanded the decks. In an environment where resistance was met with violence, and survival depended on endurance, the threat of sexual exploitation became an ever-present shadow, forcing women into a constant state of vigilance and fear, where even minor actions could provoke further abuse. This calculated cruelty intersected with all other forms of punishment and suffering aboard the ship, compounding the physical and psychological toll. Shackled wrists and ankles, relentless beatings, overcrowding, and restricted rations created a relentless cycle of hardship. But for women, the addition of sexual abuse meant that survival required navigating not only the visible threats of chains and whips but the hidden dangers of power wielded through fear and violation. The knowledge that control could be enforced through such personal and degrading means shaped behavior and interactions, fostering an atmosphere of pervasive anxiety. Yet it did not extinguish the human spirit. Even in these circumstances, women found ways to support one another, to share moments of solace and solidarity, and to maintain a sense of identity and humanity in an environment designed to strip both away. The psychological impact of such abuse reverberated through every aspect of life aboard the ship. The presence of fear, humiliation, and violation became a mechanism to suppress rebellion, to enforce obedience, and to fracture social bonds among the enslaved. Yet, paradoxically, it also became a context in which resilience and quiet defiance could emerge. Women developed subtle strategies to protect themselves and each other, sharing knowledge of which areas of the ship were safer, finding moments of privacy whenever possible, and offering comfort and support to those who had been harmed. In this way, acts of resistance were not always visible in overt rebellion, but manifested through the maintenance of dignity, care for one another, and the persistence of identity under conditions that sought to erase it. Understanding this aspect of life aboard slave ships is crucial to grasping the full scope of human suffering during the transatlantic voyage. The abuse of women cannot be separated from the broader horrors of overcrowding, beatings, shackling, and hunger, for it was intertwined with the systematic exercise of control that defined every aspect of the captives' lives. Yet within this environment of pervasive cruelty, the courage, resourcefulness, and resilience of women stand as a testament to the strength of the human spirit. They endured unimaginable violations while finding ways to sustain hope, protect one another, and assert a sense of self that resisted the efforts of their oppressors. The story of these women aboard the ships reveals not only the depths of cruelty inflicted, but also the extraordinary capacity for endurance, solidarity, and survival in circumstances designed to destroy both body and spirit, highlighting a dimension of resilience that remains profoundly compelling and essential to remember. Beyond the visible suffering of chains, hunger, and physical punishment, an equally powerful weapon shaped life aboard the slave ships. Psychological terror. The crew understood that fear could travel faster than any whip, reaching into the minds of the enslaved and shaping behavior long before any physical force was applied. Threats of death were spoken casually, not always meant to be carried out, but designed to hover constantly in the air, reminding everyone below deck that their lives were considered disposable. This ever-present menace seeped into daily existence, turning silence into dread and anticipation into anxiety, as no one could know when a threat might become reality. Public humiliation was another deliberate tool, carefully staged to erode dignity and fracture unity. Individuals were singled out, shamed in front of others, or reduced to objects of ridicule, not because humiliation alone satisfied the crew, but because it weakened communal bonds among the captives. When one person was publicly degraded, everyone felt the warning. The message was unmistakable. Identity, pride, and mutual trust could be stripped away just as easily as freedom. Forced to witness such scenes, the enslaved learned that survival often required emotional restraint, hiding grief and anger deep within, even as those emotions burned beneath the surface. Perhaps the most devastating tactic was forcing individuals to witness the punishment of others. These moments were carefully orchestrated, transforming suffering into a spectacle meant to discipline the entire ship. The goal was not only to punish one person, but to instill fear in many, to ensure that the memory of what had been seen would linger long after the event ended. Watching a fellow captive endure punishment left deep psychological scars, reinforcing helplessness and planting the idea that resistance would bring consequences not only for oneself, but for the entire community. This strategy aimed to isolate individuals emotionally, breaking the sense of shared humanity that could inspire collective strength. Yet even under such relentless psychological pressure, the bonds between the enslaved did not disappear entirely. Though fear shaped behavior, it did not fully extinguish compassion or solidarity. In whispered exchanges, in shared glances heavy with understanding, people reminded one another that they were not alone. The very acts meant to divide them sometimes had the opposite effect, creating silent alliances rooted in shared trauma and mutual recognition. The crew's attempts to dominate the mind revealed an unspoken truth. Control required constant reinforcement, because the human spirit, even when cornered, continued to resist in subtle ways. This psychological warfare worked hand in hand with physical suffering. Chains restricted bodies, hunger weakened strength, and beatings enforced discipline. But terror targeted the inner self, seeking to reshape thoughts, suppress hope, and dismantle identity. It was a system designed to make obedience feel like the only path to survival. Yet within this system, moments of mental resistance persisted, not always visible, but deeply significant. Holding on to memory, culture, and a sense of self became acts of defiance, quiet yet profound. The legacy of psychological terror aboard slave ships reminds us that oppression is not only measured in physical pain, but in the sustained effort to dominate minds and erase connection. And still, the endurance of those who survived stands as evidence that even in environments built on fear and humiliation, humanity found ways to persist, Their resilience was not always loud or dramatic, but steady and unwavering, carried forward through memory and testimony, ensuring that the psychological battles fought in the darkness of those ships are neither forgotten nor diminished. As the voyage dragged on across the ocean, the cumulative weight of punishment became impossible to ignore. Shackles that never loosened, hunger that never fully eased, wounds that were never treated, and fear that never lifted all converged into a deadly reality. These harsh punitive measures did not exist in isolation. They directly fueled the high mortality rates aboard slave ships. Disease spread rapidly in overcrowded holds. Infections took hold in open wounds left by beatings and restraints. And malnutrition weakened bodies already pushed beyond their limits. What began as punishment often ended as irreversible decline, turning the ships themselves into floating sites of suffering where survival was never guaranteed. Illness thrived in these conditions because the systems aboard were designed for control, not care. When injuries were ignored and sickness dismissed, even minor wounds became fatal. The weakened immune systems of the enslaved, strained by hunger and exhaustion, could not withstand the relentless exposure to filth, heat, and contaminated water. Each loss of life was treated as an acceptable cost of the voyage, further revealing how punishment and neglect were embedded into the structure of the trade itself. Mortality was not an accident. It was the predictable outcome of a system that prioritized profit and dominance over human life. Yet within this devastating reality, the story does not end solely in loss. The endurance of those who survived stands as a powerful testament to resilience under unimaginable conditions. Despite the constant presence of death, many continued to care for one another, offering comfort to the sick, sharing what little strength remained, and preserving a sense of humanity in an environment designed to erase it. Their survival was not simply physical but moral, a quiet resistance against a system that sought to reduce them to numbers and commodities. Understanding this history matters because it reveals how cruelty, when institutionalized, produces consequences that ripple far beyond a single journey. The high mortality rates aboard slave ships were not just statistics. They represented lives cut short, families torn apart, and futures stolen. Remembering these realities honors those who endured and those who did not survive, ensuring that their suffering is neither minimized nor forgotten. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story and reflect on a chapter of history that continues to shape the world we live in today. If you found this exploration meaningful and want to support the sharing of important historical stories like this one, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive, encourages deeper understanding, and ensures that the voices of the past continue to be heard by future generations.